Nobody give it to no Guatemala. Come on. This a fi we, with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. I know we should always help our neighbor, especially in time of a natural disaster. But this is not the case with Guatemala, because the poor people will never see a dollar. Only a few rich man will start to get richer. Today, time in this happy, like a letter because Mr. Politician, we got to change the plan. God have mercy. Mr. Politician, we got to change the plans. This happy we, with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. Oh no, this happy we, with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. Not an inch, not a foot, not a centimeter. We never give up to Guatemala, because look what them do to the people of my color. If them speak too loud, sure to get murder. Look what them do to the Indian Maya. Holy by them massacre. La mismo presidente quiere we agua, because this happy we, with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. Oh no, this happy we, with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. Believe if you need me, if you need a soldier, just send for the papa, cause I'm a true warrior. Just send for Daddy Tracy and Rankin Jr. Just send for Bernie Mac and Kenny M. Breddah. Send for Andy P, send for the Mad Rapper. Just send to Stone Jam, you are the commander, because this happy we, with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. This happy we, with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. So listen to the lyrics where Papa a chat. Some people only see ya, some see further than that. From my observations, they plan off the guats, yes. Plan off the guat to make a quick attack. But if you come to that, me I go pick up the gat. Me I go lick enough shot on the militant. Me I go shoot the Indian, me I go shoot the black. Me just lick enough shot on the militant. What? Me why you carry this message straight to the top. Me here we have a lot of island on the sea, man. Because this a fi we, with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. Oh no, this a fi we, with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. This time me name is Papa. Belize me come from the Belize City area. 110% Belize and proud of it, sir. Don't tell me about maritime area. Long time ago agreement by the slave master. Talking about the head on the Belize and dollar, because this a fi we, with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. This a fi we, with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. This a fi we, with a fear. This a fi we, with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. This one goes out to all patriots, all people who love them country bad, love them homeland. We'll never give it up to another nation. This a fi we, with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. This a fi we, with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. This time me name is Papa. Belize me come from the Belize City area. 110% Belize and proud of it, sir. Don't tell me about maritime area. Long time ago agreement by the slave master. Talking about the head on the Belize and dollar, because this a fi we, with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. Oh no, this a fi we, with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. I know we should always help our neighbor, especially in time of a natural disaster. But this is not the case with Guatemala, because the poor people will never see a dollar. Only a few rich man will start to get richer. Today, time in this happy, like a letter, because
Welcome to Sunday Review. This is where we make sense of the news. I'm the producer and host, Sister YaYa, Marin Coleman, the only news review talk show in the country. We're simulcasting on Crumb Radio. You could join me on XTV Belize and XTV Belize YouTube and Facebook page. I'm done excited, so I had to make one effort to keep my voice down. Thanks to Brother Akko and Brother Pinelo. Good morning, Brother Akko, our co-host from Trinidad and Tobago, revolutionary brother who we missed last week. And we have a guest, Brother Giovanni Pinelo. Brother Akko, how are you being this morning?
Good morning, Sister YaYa. Good morning to Brother Pinelo. Good to see you again. Good morning to our listening audience. I am very well, Sister YaYa. It's a bit rainy in Trinidad right now, but I'm happy to be on the show this weekend and this Sunday, having missed it last week.
Indeed, I want to make this Sunday so special. This is Sunday Review African Liberation Day edition. After I introduce Brother Giovanni, I'll make Brother Akko tell you what the African Liberation Day and why today is so special for you. Brother Giovanni Pinelo, that's not your first time there, but usually there by yourself, usually there with Brother Rolando. So, Brother Giovanni Pinelo is Senior Research Officer from the Belize Institute for Social and Cultural Research, ISCR, which is the one division of the National Institute of Culture and History, NIH. Rolando, oh, I forget what, Cocom. Brother Rolando Cocom is the director for ISCR niche, and Brother Giovanni, they work closer together, senior researcher. Brother Giovanni, you ready for this Sunday Review
Hi.
edition, African Liberation Day reasoning?
Sure, sure. Good morning, everyone. Morning, Sister YaYa, Brother Akko, and our audience. It's a privilege to join you once again.
I always happy to have you. Make I just give heads up and tell that one of the reasons why we have only Brother Giovanni and no Brother Rolando, because they usually come together, is that from doing work on behalf of United Black Association for Development Educational Foundation, UEF, the Fourth Pillar Zinc Fence, whenever people contact me and ask me about black people that believes, they primarily just talk about Garifuna people, because when then the research that the was then say come up, they don't say nothing much about so what I call the Creole ethnic group. And so I identify as my spirit having an African woman experience. Because my people know that identify as Creole people are saying, you know what? Make I make one effort for link people where have that duty for tell the complete story of African people, I believe. So one of my sister from Trinidad and Tobago that she that a curator for the Caribbean collection at the British Library, Heart of Empire. And she tell me that they had a fellowship with them at the offer. I applied for the fellowship, I never get it. And then I got up online, and it's called the Eccles Institute. Now, the Eccles Institute for the Americas work for increased awareness and use of the British Library extensive collection of books, manuscripts, journals, newspapers, and song recordings related to the United States, Canada, and the Caribbean. So they had one call for papers, and they had one where I had one interest in us specifically. It was called 20th Century, and if you could show that, Christy, the people always submit 20th Century Black Periodicals and Space, Internationalism, Diaspora, and Pan-Africanism in Black Periodical Cultures in Belize, 1900 to 2000. So right away, I know Brother Pinelo, he's not a research expert when it comes to the archives. UEF had a meeting with ISCR niche, Brother Giovanni and Brother Rolando. They're like, right away, they suggest 1900 to 2100 years, that a latter time. Make we broke it down. So we broke it down in 1900 to 1921, and then 1935 to 2025. So I did the presentation on the 8th of May, one day after I turned 59, by Zoom, and then I said, Brother Pinelo couldn't make it. So I said, you know what, for African Liberation Day, make we flesh it out. So I'm telling you right now, the bulk of the stories we want to hear today, and Brother, I come and share more about why African Liberation Day matters, is about African people in the Caribbean and what that have to do with we where they are still it to the day. But I could take it away and tell you why all of this halabaloo, excitement, remembrance of African ancestresses and ancestors, May 25th, 2025, known as African Liberation Day.
Okay, so it was known as African Liberation Day. It is now called Africa Day, and it was formerly called African Freedom Day. Now, the day was established by the OAU as the founding day, May 25th of the OAU in 1963. The OAU stands for the Organization of African Unity. When the day was established, one of the main focus was the struggling people in Southern Africa and parts of Eastern Africa who were struggling against colonization in Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and other places like that, and also the struggle in South Africa and Zimbabwe. So the African Liberation Day, as it was established, made a commitment to promote these struggles and to ensure that there are no more colonies on the African continent. So you had Portuguese colonies in Angola and Mozambique. You had the British in what was called Rhodesia, named after Cecil Rhodes, and you had the struggle in South Africa taking place. And then you had Guinea-Bissau, which was also Portuguese colony in West Africa. So African Liberation Day was celebrated throughout the world. I remember in Trinidad and Tobago, we had massive events nationwide to highlight the plight of our people on the African continent. We had things like speeches, we showed films, and we had various activities. Later on, the day was changed to African Freedom Day by the AU, I think it was, and then it is now called Africa Day. And what is happening today in parts of Africa is that there are demonstrations all over Africa in support of the freedom of Africa. In fact, just before I came on here, I was looking at one in Ghana that started at a particular point in Accra and went to Freedom Square, where Kwame Nkrumah ultimately declared Ghana independent. And it's a lot of interesting things that was I saw in that demonstration, comments against imperialism, against neocolonialism, and so on. So it is very important that we understand the history of the day, right? As it impacts the Caribbean, after the OAU morphed into the AU, which is the African Union, the African Union incorporated the diaspora in the entire framework of Africa. And the Caribbean, I think, became the sixth region of the African Union. And so we are now seen as part of the wider African continent, not just the diaspora, as we put it, but part of the wider African continent. And as I was just sharing with you, Sister YaYa, we have had a very long history of people from the Caribbean contributing to the liberation of Africa. One of the early pioneers in the Pan-African movement, George Padmore and Henry Sylvester Williams, were two Trinidadians who were instrumental in founding the first Pan-African Congress in 1900 in Manchester, England, right? When Nkrumah came to power, Padmore went on to become one of the principal advisors of Nkrumah. And I think there is some monument to George Padmore in Ghana as we speak. Additionally, a number of the African countries who were victimized by the British during colonialism lacked certain kind of human resources and so on. So a number of African people from the Caribbean went to many African countries and contributed to running governments, the public service, and so on. For example, one of the judges of the High Court in Tanzania was a Dominican-born Trinidad jurist. He later became a judge in Trinidad, Justice Telford George, was a senior person in the courts in Tanzania. Also, we had people from Jamaica and Trinidad going to Ghana to help with the public service there. I have a friend whose father, she's Jamaican, but her father was actually born in Ghana because her grandfather went to Ghana to work in the public service to support the fledgling African country. One of the things I was sharing with you, Trinidadian railway workers were pioneering figures in the establishing the railway in Nigeria. And there's a document on it, it might be on YouTube, in which you see these Trinidadians helping to establish the rail tracks and train the Nigerians in running and establishing the railroad. So we have always had this contribution from the Caribbean linked to Africa. There's a person, Ras Makonnen, who was a Guyanese, who was a principal figure in running some of the enterprises for Haile Selassie in Ethiopia and subsequently in Ghana. Actually, he died under mysterious circumstances in Africa. So this history is there. So when we observe African Liberation Day, we are not just talking about intangibles. We are speaking of direct connections and direct contributions by African people, all in the 1800s and the early 1900s to the continent of Africa. So African Liberation Day is not just a continental observance. It has very significant relevance to the Caribbean, even here, and I think I told you, I'm not sure if I mentioned it previously, that one of the leading banks in Ghana at this point in time is Republic Bank from Trinidad and Tobago. And this was a bank that the movement I was part of, led by the National Redaction Committee, called the Black War Movement, we fought very hard to nationalize the banking sector in Trinidad and Tobago, which was owned by Canadians and British and Americans. And Republic Bank, which was Barclays Bank DCO at the time, was renamed. Barclays Bank was renamed Republic Bank after it was nationalized. It still remains a wholly owned Trinidad and Tobago bank, and is one of the larger banks in Ghana with 42 branches in the Republic of Ghana. So here you have these contributions, and there are so many other contributions that, like for example, my wife's aunt, she went, she was a teacher here in Trinidad, and she went to Ghana to teach, and she subsequently died in Ghana and was very seriously honored there. So we have had these long contributions of people from the Caribbean going to Africa and not only that, the other thing is during the war, the Italian the war, or the Italians ran against Ethiopia. Many Caribbean people volunteered to go to Africa, to Ethiopia, and actually fight. And there were many villages that in Trinidad were named after Ethiopian villages and towns. For example, the village I'm from, there was an oilfield village called Abyssinia, which was the name for Ethiopia at one point in time. So we've had this kind of history, long history. There are many calypsos. There was a famous one by Lord Beginner, I think it was in Trinidad, and if you Google it, you'll see it. And the chorus is the gold, Mussolini won from Africa. And he was singing that song in support of what happened in Ethiopia during the Italian war against Ethiopia. So African Liberation Day is as much something for us to celebrate in the Caribbean as it is for Africans on the continent to celebrate, because we made significant contributions to the liberation of Africa and continue to make contributions to Africa at this point.
Big thanks, Brother Akko. I just want you to know how much we value your wealth of knowledge, and that you could talk, a language we could relate to. And the years that you've contributed to the struggle for collective liberation as African people, Brother Akko. Big respect. Like Brother Ancestor Kwame Nkrumah say, we are Africans not because we were born in Africa, but because Africa born in a we. Brother Giovanni, when you hear about African Liberation Day, what come to your mind?
There's a whole lot. There's a whole lot. For one, living out district, there would appear to be some sort of a disconnect from the actual goings on. But in my personal experience, by reading and by listening to older folks, we realized that the wall that would appear to have been there in terms of understanding each other was only as thick as one would think, because in Belize we've had the privilege of traveling, people coming into our community or ourselves going into other communities. And when I started to more read, because of course the World Wide Web was not, the internet was not here, but we had access to our libraries. And so reading, visiting the libraries and readings and listening to our elders, there's so many of the connections that I can personally make in understanding that we are not in isolation, in understanding that African connections, the direct links have been here with our people. And I mean, we could readily see it in terms of the cultural practices, in terms of the experiences of our people. And it goes beyond just Belize. For me in particular, I know it's right across the Peten. as a clear example, no, of how many things, of how things would occur. Listening to Brother Ako speak about the goings on and some of the protagonists and the African um, people in reconnecting and going back to Africa. You brought out Rhodesia. We were, we would follow up a lot on this. I recall reading, of course, from Newsweek, from Time Magazine, these the stories, and albeit that they were, of course, from one perspective. As we mature in our reading, we realize that, hey, we're listening to one side of the story. Where is the other side of the story? And so having programs like these, listening to your conversation, sheds a lot of light. I know in one of our readings in research, we came across um, there was a governor who was afraid that in Belize we would end up having the Abyssinian problem, as he would write on it. No? And this is the 1920s. Um, I recall reading some time ago about that, and I looked it up. The war, Ethiopia, and so on. So there were a lot of parallels there, and so it's not all that difficult to truly understand that beyond thinking Creole, that there is an African connection, and I would dare say, in almost every village, in at least 80% of our villages across this nation, there is some element that eventually we can trace, that we can connect to African origins. So, for starters.
That's a big reveal. I know in Guyana there's a whole research being done on the village movement and the connection to African resistance during the time of enslavement. And so they'll have a lot of, besides we don't know if we African connection stories, in individual Caribbean territories, we don't know about the other Caribbean territories as well, which are why in the 2025 Sunday Review, thanks to Brother Ako, the focus so strongly on the Caribbean. And one other thing of interest to me as it relates to Belize, and I want to talk about this too, is there, to me, I would read that there's always been a class divide. So let's say in the enslavement period, and I talk about the enslaved people in the house and the enslaved people in the field. So there's a class divide. Now, they're not for sure the people who are enslaving at the house under the boss, because then did poison some people and did tell about some of the things they want to hear in the house way, even though they might have dressed better than the one outside and eat differently and take on some of the enslavers' attitude and behavior, that I find that there's that class divide. So coming from, I remember for we story, and I start with the 500 years plus of enslavement, we were the first people to contribute to world civilization. So make that of we bigger picture as an African people. We had around 500 years plus of interruption of that. So we make it clear for we story that not just about the enslavement of African people and the continuous enslavement through colonialism and neocolonialism. I can't say that enough. So for go back to the within that 500 plus years, I want to get Brother Ako and Brother Giovanni take on how does say one class issue between like enslaved Africans in the field, they want in at the house, and then like in a Belize case, then you have revolts, and so you'll find when the people then were outside. And I don't know the evidence, just what I say, Brother Giovanni could tell me if most of the people then were run away, that Belize, if they were the mostly men, and they would mostly be outside. So that we never have one plantation economy, so you wouldn't have like enslaved people in at the house. So again, you have people outside the road, or another class of people. When you come up into the 1800s, which I have one interest, 1894, the laborers' riot. 1919, July 22nd, primarily working class people. When they tell the story, they tell you that veterans coming back from the war, how they frame it, meaning the colonizers and those who work for the colonizers and the enslavers. And then you come up into the 1930s and you look for Antonio Soberanes, working class people again. So what I say happened continuously. Working class people, what we call organic or grassroots intellectuals, limited and could read, but have the knowledge world knowledge, local knowledge, lived experience, then get together, then organize enough for them best interest when it comes to not having adequate housing, just like 2025, not having not a pay we fairly for we labor, not having access to food, we not get what I tell you them and give we if we go fight for them as far as land and allowances. So I want where I want brother Akwan, brother Giovanni answer for me. If my analysis accurate, that there's always been a class issue within African people communities, and then within the larger um, enslavement, colonial, neo-colonial system. No worry, I could go into the second segment with this, but I come make I get no make I go to Giovanni first, cause he not the guest. But Giovanni, what their take on it?
Has there been a division? There has always been divisions. There have always been divisions in terms of uh, when we look at our stories, um, to keep for one group of people to keep uh, a larger amount of persons from getting together, from being in solidarity with each other, then the most famous adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, is what is applied. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so you and I will not be able to work together, even though we may have similar causes, even though we may be going through the same type of oppression, because at some point in time, the oppressor finds a way of enticing both of us separately, and therefore uh, breeds in a degree of suspicion between us, but an affinity, of a link between the oppressor and the oppressed. And it's until the oppressed begin to see each other as a fellow human being, when they begin to see each other as being together and needing each other, that you begin to change. And so how was this being done? For one, absolutely, uh, it was by tidbits. It was by offering um, some type of privilege over the masses, over your fellow uh, comrades in the same space and place. Um, Remember that education as such was not available in terms of talking about academics. The reading and the writing was for a privileged few. So those who did work who had some degree of trust within the enslaver's house would, of course, probably be a part and parcel of learning from the tutor or the tutoress, the governess teaching the enslaver's child. And therefore, if one of the children of the enslaver has that degree, then they'll be able to learn to read and write. But there's that element of trust versus distrust. And so the wider populace, of course, we would all go with the same type of education, particularly values, the human values. And if you notice it across the societies, that was there. But there was something else that would break that special bond between peoples. And the stories that we've read, I know that we were more exposed to uh, understanding the concept of enslavement in a benevolent sense in Belize, but never being told the cruelty of it. So that yes, there was division. Yes, there would be some degree of resentment. You're talking about human beings. When we look at the records here, there's so many of the stories that pop out. People from the lower echelon having clashes, having conflicts with each other, and having to resolve it using the oppressor's system of law. So, yeah, there has been, there will be, and until we open our eyes more clearly, then until that time, that may continue to be the case.
Mike, ask the brother Giovanni, is it, and I could accept that the colonizer enslaver have quite a bit to do with the division, But in bringing it forward to let's say 2025, I think we as African people have to look upon ourselves and be honest about some of the vision that not all my skin folk are my kinfolk. And they're not even so much that the colonizer, they, they sweeten the pot for some of our African leaders. Well, a lot of our African leaders not have no, I don't know what guidance spiritually or ethically, but because based on what I say and what I do, my observation would be they don't have no accountability to self that then could consistently betray we. So, so yes, I want to say the colonizer always have one role for playing our division, but then we have to look upon ourselves and say what role we have in our own division, and how do we hold each other accountable for say this must stop, because a part of African liberation data for imagine one different future for our unborn children. Right. And so we want to look upon the past, the present, and the future, and offer something else different. But I call you want to get a whole, we have to come up for you in a second segment, but just because of what Brother Pinelo said just now. So I can hear what you about that, Brother Pinelo, before we go to break.
Well, the first thing I want to highlight is in our conversations earlier and what you said me about the 1894, those were good riots, right? So this is African Liberation Day, and we have to understand language and context. Now, we continue to refer to our revolts as riots because that's what the British told us they were. A riot is an unplanned something. That is, so these things were revolts. And language, they have always used language to create narratives. This is what they're doing right now with Abraham Traore and so on. So the first thing I would want to suggest on this African liberation, as part of the decolonization, we have to decolonize our language. Our struggle is not, should not be termed riots. They would never were. They were genuine acts of resistance and revolt. And I'll tell you how language is used. Those of us who grew up with comic books, reading comic books and so on, we read those comic books of the indigenous people of America called the Indians fighting the whites in America. When the whites defeated the Indians, it was a victory. When the Indians defeated the whites, it was a massacre. So here these Indians were defending their land that you took from them. You came, you took it, poisoned them, killed them, put disease. And when they fought back and defeated you, you say it's a massacre. But when you inflicted genocide on them, it's a victory. And I think in the Caribbean, we still have this idea. So in Trinidad, we refer to our workers' revolt of 1937 as the labor riots of 1937. Then there was a revolt against water rates. We call that the water riots and so on. And we have to stop using this colonial language to denote our struggles. We must refer to these things as what they are. They were revolts, they were acts of resistance. And so moving forward, if we are to consider ourselves liberated in thought, we have to decolonize this language and state very clearly what these struggles were. They were revolt against oppression, colonialism, and enslavement. So that's what I wanted to begin with. I don't know if I have time to go into the second part of it.
No, we have to go on a break. And I agree with you 100%. And Brother Giovanni, I get you to come after break. So for people who may have just joined us, or if you're listening on local television, listen on local crime radio, live streaming and XTV at XTV Belize YouTube, XTV Belize Facebook. Thank you. Share a link, share a link. This is a Sunday review, African Liberation Day edition with our guest, Brother Giovanni Pinelo from ISCR Niche, and our co-host, Brother Mutota from Trinidad and Tobago. Break time. This is a part we make sense of the news.
Imagine getting rewarded
to the Sunday Review African Liberation Day edition. We have our guest, Brother Giovanni Pinelo from ISCR Niche, and our co-host, Brother Mutota from Trinidad and Tobago. Our Facebook post, Sonia Allen said, Morning, my good, loyal, faithful sister to XTV and Creme Radio programming out in the United States of America. Brother Akko, go ahead and finish your...
So, Sister, the question was related to the divisions of our people, right? So you have to understand what Yanka would call the Columbus Enterprise, which was the slave trade, which some people like to refer to as the transatlantic slave trade. And we are asking people, some people have been asking not to use that term because the Atlantic never enslaved anybody. It's the Europeans who enslaved. And so when you say transatlantic slave trade, you separate it from the perpetrators, because it's as if the sea did something and the sea didn't do anything. It was the European slave trade. So one of the things about this European slave trade is that from the beginning, it divided people in order to conquer them. That's the first thing. So every civilization, every society has its contradictions. I mean, even villages. I remember growing up as a child, as a boy, the village up the road, didn't necessarily like the guys from the other village that want to talk to the pretty girls, in the village. So you had those contradictions. And so that would play out in Carnival where the steel band from the other village will clash with the steel band because some guy talked to the girl, and so on and so forth. So you have these contradictions. They are natural to human beings. And in Africa, of course, you had those contradictions. So remember, Africa was not a monolithic entity. It was a continent with different peoples, like the United States of America, North America. You had different, what they call tribes existing in America, Native American tribes. You have the Apache, Arapaho, and different ones. So you had people, which are nations really. So you had these contradictions. And did they get into little fights with each other? Yes, they did. What the European slave trade did in order to conquer was to exacerbate these differences, highlight them, these differences. And so when Africans were captured and brought to the New World, which is the US, the Caribbean, the America, and the Caribbean, one of the things they did was to put different people, different things. So they'll put Igbos with Yorubas, Yorubas with Congo. Sometimes these people couldn't understand each other. It's the same way like putting a Frenchman with a Spaniard. They don't understand each other. But this is what happened on the plantation. So at the very genesis of the slave trade were divisions. And then these divisions were manufactured further and elaborated in different ways. So for example, I'll give you the famous quote Malcolm X used to use, the house Negroes and the field slaves. So among the enslaved Africans, there was these divisions between those who worked in the master's house and those who worked in the fields, right? And I'll show you how it's exactly. There's a term we use, high on the hog. You know that term? High on the hog. No, most people don't know how that came into being. That actually came from the plantation. Because the enslaved who lives in the master's house ate meat higher up on the pig. And those who were in the field ate pig feet, and which we still have as a diet in the Caribbean today. You can't tell people don't eat a pig foot sauce, right? So the term high on the hog denoted a class difference on the plantation. In that those who lived in the fields eat pig feet and pig guts and all that. Those who lived in the master's house, they ate a little higher on the hog. They ate, right. And so when that was established, automatically there was a division between the field slave and the house slave. And then that assumes certain kind of social consequences of how they ate. Because one ate better and one ate worse. And so these things continued to be evolved as the enslavers sought ways as a minority to control the majority. They utilized different techniques. So one of the things that happened was the masters actually impregnated African women through rape and various kinds of things, which then created a color division, right? So, for example, um, if you go to places like New Orleans, you will hear this term called passe blanc, which has been passing for white in patois, right? And you hear a term used called handkerchief heads. Now, the term handkerchief head came from the fact that there were a lot of women who were very light in color, but who passed for white because they put a handkerchief on their heads so that you couldn't see the kinky hair. So these were class divisions that existed in places like New Orleans and in Barbados, right? In Barbados, they have a particular term for those whites who were born. They call them Bacrajani, right? So these divisions were created on the plantation and existed, and then they became exacerbated post the slave period into emancipation. These divisions became more stark or sharper as the minority again sought to dominate the majority. So these mulattoes at times, and they played a critical role in undermining the Haitian Revolution. These mulattoes, because they were of European extract, some of them, and because they had emotional connections to sometimes their father, who was an enslaver, they always walked this line between the dark-skinned African and the light-skinned one, right? In fact, another thing that we didn't understand, even the term Creole, when it was first utilized, actually, the original Creole was a European born in the New World. They said one of the early Creole was Simon Bolivar, because Simon Bolivar was a white who was born in Venezuela. And so when he went to Spain, he was not treated like a European. He was treated like some outsider because they did not consider a white born in the colonies as a true European. And so he was so angry by this that he realized he had more in common with the indigenous and the Africans, and he came back to lead the revolution. So the first Creoles were actually whites who were born in the colonies, whether they were French or whether they were Spanish. And so a culture of Europe and the African and the indigenous developed, which is what's called the Creole culture. That's a story for another time. So, but if you want to understand the class differences in the Caribbean, you have to understand this matrix, this milieu that emerged out of enslavement, and then that transmitted itself into our societies and even carried on into these modern day societies that we have, right? So, because it's a sociology that was developed on division, whether it was color, skin, and then later on it assumed the roles of who were more educated, and so on and so forth. And that is the beginning of what you want to call the class division, and we'll get up to the modern class division. But the Cubans have a very interesting person they spoke about called Malinche. And the Cubans speak of Malincheism. Malinche was the first indigenous person who collaborated, I think, with Cortez and created a first and had a relationship with Cortez, or one of Cortez's men, and her son Martin was born. And Martin was the first mestizo in the hemisphere. So in some parts of Latin America, they see Malinche as a heroic figure, and some parts they see her as a person who sold out, right? Because what she did, she was one of the persons who understood the language of the indigenous and was able to translate for Cortez what the indigenous was doing. So to understand the class differences in the Caribbean, we have to understand and Latin America and Central America, we have to understand the slave trade, colonization, the slave trade, colonization, and how these things evolve in order for a minority to remain dominant over the majority of the population.
Big respect, Brother Akko. You sure pulled the.
So the last thing I want to say, the Cubans refer to a person, a philosophy called Malincheism. And anybody who they see as a sellout, they say they're practicing Malincheism based on this thing, Malinche. And if you read up, you'll see Malinche was a Mexican woman who was in a relationship with Cortez and so on. Yes.
Thanks, Brother Akko. Big respect. Brother Giovanni, you ready for answer the question I'm going to ask you? And keeping in mind the same thing you said, Brother Akko expanded on it. And then I'm like, when you look at present day, like I'm looking for, because two things are true at the same time. The ownership of, let's say, African people contributing to that divide. Where do we take ownership in that?
Oh, that's it's a heavy laden question, and it's not a matter of pointing fingers in in a general sense, but in reality we have to take that inward look as to who we are, and we have to understand, we have to make those connections with our elders. I think Brother Akko's um, talk there about La Malinche, Cortez's wife, who bore him the son Martin, is clearly an example. And yes, in Mexico, they have gone through that analysis of looking at La Malinche, because here's this native woman um, who has been, the Spanish writings, of course, say she was on their side. But what do we know as to what was her reason? Why was she co-opting, or why was she co-opted to be on the European side? And if we fast forward that into Belize, we have similar scenarios. And I think it's a little bit even more when we look at our stories, how that violent and systemic elements of control were imposed on our people. Colonizing Belize was a male enterprise. Where do you get the woman? Men coming into Maya communities, because we see records, we are aware of records where many of the men would raid Maya communities. And so again, where do we quote unquote classify individuals who were the result of such a violent act on our women? And it was even more so among our African women. But to make that even worse was the breakup of the families. I think one of the things that we have to start going back into, one form of reconnection, is looking at our own family structures. Where do you and I fit in? Where do the values that our people, that our elders have passed on, where do they fit in? Mind you, in some areas, the values today are living for today, surviving for today. But does that justify the endemic violence that occurred then and that is occurring today? It's not that easy. Again, the same persons who were in control had the political power, they had the institutional power, they had these legal channels of control, and that in and of itself was used. It was used according to the people who were in control to suit themselves. Cases such as manumissions. I think we were off air when Brother Akko was speaking about the Sunday market. Yeah, you go to church and the rest of the day you spend it in your plantation grounds. Again, it was an economic thing for the oppressor. The less he has to spend on your food, the better it is for his own economic gain. But at the same time, that even though that allowed for the continuity of crops and values and music and song, there were all these legal mechanisms that were set in place. Case in point in Belize, 1795, the banning of drumming. A law is passed, and the law was such that it was very oppressive. It was you would think that it would be prohibitive, but it was more than that. So that the type of threats that our people face, and that we continue to face because there's some quote unquote simple laws that are there, they continue to marginalize us. So how do we break this? It's been there before. You mentioned earlier, Sister Yaya, looking at the terminologies with ethnicities. Yeah, for us, in terms of geography and social isolation, was probably a blessing in disguise. I may want to use that as on, by looking at it in the sense that in many of our communities, our people were able to survive. Our people were able to retain those values, the values of respect for each other, the values of understanding that together we can achieve much. Unfortunately, it's in those areas where people were reduced to mere chattel, to mere uh, items of possession, to mere workers for a few, that these type of psychological and cultural suppressions would have a more negative impact. In Belize, again, as we look through our records, we find several of the stories. And yes, there are also those stories where the colonizer would recognize an illegitimate child, give him or her a title, and provide some degree of education outside of this country. And you and I are quite familiar with people saying, hey, if you want to succeed, then you have to be like so and so and so. And the people that are identified are those in the privileged class. And so stepping up the ladder, that social mobility then would also mean getting rid of your cultural, of your personal, of your familial ties and values. And we see that disconnection among our very own people in the present. So it's difficult only as long as we make it difficult, only as long as we keep it hidden, as long as we do not share the values that really make us more attuned with the sense of respect, of that humanness and the human kindness that has been transmitted by our African peoples, by our indigenous peoples. Until that time, we may continue to face such issues. Huh?
You said a mouthful, brother Giovanni. Before we go to break, following up on what you just said about the, let's say, African value system in Belize, and it wasn't like cultural performance. Like people actually live their values as a way of life. So for just come back a little bit more on the paper that we submitted to the Eccles Institute, Internationalism, Diaspora, and Pan-Africanism in Black Periodical Cultures in Belize, 1900 to 2000. And we looked at 1900 to 1921 and 1935 to 2025. How did, and Christy, if you could show the magazine, the old newspaper where Brother Giovanni gonna pull up. How did, we have 7 minutes before, did, remember, a lot of them people never know to read and write. So how did black newspapers within those time frames impact black Belizean people for nurture for their political awareness and their live experience for organize and revolt in their own interest, that Belize?
Yeah, certainly. As we know, there were a few who did have the opportunity of reading and writing. The schools and the schools, of course, that were set up in the colonies, the in Belize as a colony at the time, were run by the church. And so reading and writing, arithmetic becomes a critical component of education. And of course, if you know, you know. And once you know, there will be people who want to know. So sharing the stories. So it wasn't uncommon, as in some of the newspapers we read through, that it wasn't uncommon that people would gather, very much as was done in Africa, gathering under the tree, listening to the griot, similar scenarios. So by listening and what was more, by observing the goings on, our people were able to understand what were some of these things that were impacting them, what were some of the avenues of information, of control, and thereby resistance that would occur, because people were not just quiet. All these, when we look at the early newspapers, there is a mix. There's a mixture um, of news. While international and European-based news makes the headlines, you find that within the pages there is something that is ongoing. Many of these were daily newspapers, and eventually they became weekly. But the stories that are brought out, it all depended on the editors, and what was for them being considered at the time. So we find too that the colonial authorities were pretty much aware of how the Negro world, Garvey's newspaper, was playing a critical role. It was being brought in, and as we rightly point out, as we saw in your presentation, Sister YaYa, that these were coming through Mexico. These were coming through Guatemala, through Honduras. Bear in mind that a number of the shipping companies, the United Food Company, in and of itself had its workers, its employees. Belize had a direct connection in terms of the mail and the supply of bananas and other products as these steamboats would travel to New Orleans. And definitely from there was one other way of bringing in the news. So stories were being shared. Our people would gather at what was Mule Park, downtown Belize City. They would gather at what is now Battlefield Park, what was then Battlefield Park. And of course, the stories would be brought home. So when we look at what the impact that the newspapers would have, it went beyond just one or two or a handful of individuals who had a degree of schooling, being able to read, but they were also sharing the stories. So that the grassroots people then were able to monitor the goings on. And as a result, the philosophies, the concepts, the ideas, this impetus to know who we are and how we are connected would have played a key role in people coming together, in seeing that many of the things that one group elsewhere was going through were similar to what Belizeans were going through at the time. So that, so much so then that we are able to see the connect. We are able to hear stories. There are examples in a couple of the newspapers where even Creole is being written. There are people like, there was a guy, I think it was from Antigua, Thompson was his surname, who was in some school in the north, and he was writing to the newspapers and using Creole and using pseudonyms. Use one, for example, Keziah Mims. Keziah, K-E-Z-I-A-H, Keziah Mims. Use another one from the West, Jane, I forgot her surname. But he used those to make the stories be local individuals telling their story of what are some of the things that are going on and how the colonial authorities were, what they were doing or not doing. So these were ways that those stories would, of course, play out in gatherings, at social gatherings. And yeah, the colonial authorities also kept a close eye on these things.
Big thanks, Brother Giovanni. Brother Akko, I see you right. We're going to break. I want to come back, Brother Akko, and get the mic. Make it tell you amusing since they listen so intently. But what we think, remember now, this is a Sunday Review African Liberation Day edition. We'll do what we call Sankofa. You go back, get the best of our African ancestors and ancestors, teach we, live through, left for we. We look for what we could use currently, and we have our own imagination and creativity for pass the baton to the next generation that for their life will be better than ours and those who came before us as African people, racialized as black people, that believes in the Caribbean, throughout the diaspora, and especially on the continent of Africa. Break time.
Moms continue to create
Brother Brother Giovanni, the African Liberation Day edition. So, Brother Akko, the mic that for you, me listen patiently. And if I tell you what, this is our last segment, so you have to tell you about African people organizing the Trinidad, because we don't know one another's stories. But tell me what you want to tell you, Brother Akko.
Well, I think the question you asked earlier was how could people understand what was happening without being able to read? So I would begin before the thing before I begin what I have to say by making a statement CLR James wrote about. And in an interview, someone made a statement that part of the problem with Africans in the Caribbean is that we lost everything. And CLR said, no, we didn't lose everything. And the person said, well, what do you mean? He said, we had ourselves. He said, we came with ourselves. And what he meant was that we had an intelligence, we had thinking, we had capacity, which is what comprises the self. If you want to go back to the ancient Kemetic concept about the human being made up in different parts. And C.L.R. James said, we came with ourselves. What did that self mean? That we immediately understood oppression and therefore immediately began to resist it. Now, some of the resistance took place in the form of revolts, some assumed different forms, some assumed poisoning people, some of the oppressors. But a key part of our resistance was learning to read. And there are many stories, right, in the United States, at the risk of death and amputation, enslaved people secretly teaching one another to read. So what they understood that someone had to know, and therefore that one who knew shared the story with those who didn't know. And that was a critical part of our resistance. So that is how, despite the fact that a significant part of the population were illiterate, that they could understand. Because someone who knew would share it to them, as Brother Giovanni referenced earlier. And that is something we have to understand. So that when we spoke about, education, it wasn't education in the sense of schooling. And this is the point Mwalimu Shuja make very well in his book, Too Much Schooling, Too Little Education, right? What eventually happened was that we assumed schooling was education. But on the plantation, in the plantation system, people understood education to mean what it was, giving you the means and the capability to survive and to ensure your progenitors survive, right? And that was a critical form of resistance. So even though a significant section of the enslaved could not read, those who did taught and shared the information with those who didn't. It's the same, I don't know, we have something called the yam vine or the grapevine, and we call it the bird vine in Trinidad. It's on the bird vine. Right. So this is what it was. All those concepts came from the plantations in which you would share information with someone far away through those who knew sharing their knowledge. So that's a critical part of our resistance to understand, which I think sometimes is not emphasized enough because we talk about the fighting but even sometimes there are passive forms of resistance that occurred in which they will tell the enslaved to move a bucket and you will move the spade. And so the European will say, oh, he's stupid. But it was a passive form of resistance. He knew that if he took time to move the spade, and that took up 10 minutes, then that affected them economically. These were things we understood. You see, people didn't understand that we understood those things. So they would tell them, move something here, and they would go and move the wrong thing. And then the master would say, oh, he's stupid African and don't know what he's doing. But we knew it was a form of passive resistance, like learning was a form of resistance, And those are things we have to emphasize, especially in a world now in which they could see what you're doing, know what you're doing through all these different electronic eavesdropping form. We have to learn from these ancestral attitudes and memory in order to combat what we are dealing with now. So resistance, we have to develop and redevelop or reinterpret contextually these forms of resistance that our ancestors mastered during the plantation period. Another point you made, Sister YaYa, about I think earlier you made about African leaders not serving the interests of their people. And I've always said this relative to the continental Africans. I don't know a single African leader in the last 50 years was educated in an indigenous African institution. All of them, even the progressive ones, they were taught by European, American, and other kinds of institutions, right? So that some of them betrayed the learning that they got and the conditioning to serve the people. But the system of education or miseducation, as Carter G. Woodson put it in the miseducation of the Negro, it was meant to serve the interest of the economic owners, landlords, and so on. And these are things we have to understand. This is why, in my own context, and you asked me about Trinidad, in which we do not, in the revolutionary movement, we do not honor Eric Williams. A lot of people lionize Eric Williams for his book Capitalism and Slavery, which was a new take on the abolition of the plantation economy. But this was the same man who, when he came to Trinidad as to lead the people in their independence struggle, this was the same man. He made this statement: "Massa Day done." What that meant was the Massa Day was over. Massa Day done. That was his famous statement. So for people like my mother and their generation, that was the thing they wanted to hear. Massa Day done. We're getting rid of the white man, right? The European, the colonizer. But what Williams did, like most Caribbean leaders, they engaged in sloganeering without no policy to implement these slogans. So while he said Massa Day done, what did he do? He signed and created an arrangement with the Catholic Church called the Concordat, in which he gave education back to the masses, right? So despite the fact that we were saying Massa Day done, the education system was still elitist, still classist, controlled by the very people who are the descendants of the enslavers and the institutions that worked for the enslavers to enslave us. So, and if you look throughout the Caribbean, that is what it is. So they knew what to say when, but they never implemented policy to transform. They never implemented a policy of decolonization. So today in Trinidad and Tobago, our education system is still modeled around the British grammar school system 60 odd years after independence, which was meant to produce clerks and mechanics and so on for the economic system. That's what we have. We have no education system in the Caribbean or in Africa that speaks to our own needs, to our own transformation, and to our economic, social, and political development. And part of the transformation of the Caribbean, part of the liberation process, is that we not only have to decolonize education, we have to recreate an education model that serves our interests. None of our leaders in the post-independence period have developed or initiated any concept of education that teaches us how to free ourselves, how to liberate ourselves from Europeanization and colonization and neo-colonization.
Well said, Brother Akko. Well said. And I appreciate that you consistently come back to the systemic betrayal of our people, generations, and make that connection to not having, and this is why for day one we were conscious and advocate for African reparation, inclusive of cognitive, environmental, justice, and I forget the third one, and reparatory justice. The cognitive come first, because there are other ways of knowing and being outside a European one. So the connection where you make to many of the world leaders on the continent of Africa, especially, not that we know of, having one indigenous African way, let's say live African spirituality, which wouldn't, if you live it every day, knowing we're human being with flaws, you wouldn't say that kind of systemic betrayal of our people and the miseducation of our beings, especially when it comes to organized religion, where it's still managed more to a school state system, that we keep we enslaved. Because let's on this African Liberation Day, let's be clear, we are not free people. So when you have that UEF have to tell that day 262, no, they're not tell that day 262, tell that day 264, that we advocate for the state with our leadership and direction, create one natural hair law. It tell you how to enslave, and this is not just the Belize. This is a majority of the Caribbean countries, for example. That we still not accepted to come and get schools miseducated based on how we wear our hair, or even that you have to wear uniforms. And people are very locked in on that they're not open to hear anything else. They want blind obedience to authority. Brother Giovanni, you've been quiet for a while. We have another 15 or so minutes. In 2025, you got you a lot of archival evidence. What is it that gives you hope, Brother Giovanni, for us as African people? Because again, you have more exposure to historical writings, memoirs, legal documents, church papers, and we know that European people write them officially. But you also see the stories of we people and how to resist. What still give you hope in that 2025? You see any recent story where you want to tell me about anything where you're like, man, if more people may hear this or know this, they want keep heart that we have to continue the struggle for the next generation?
Earlier, you had asked me how did people 100 years ago get their stories, how in this day and age with social media and beyond, it may be a little easier, or maybe more difficult, because the focus is not there on our own. I think 90% of what our young people are viewing on social media, on Facebook and Instagram, has very little to do with who we are as a people. One of the places, and again, things that were going on back then, our people would have to go to the hospitals, to the clinics, and they meet other people who are in the same or suffering from similar diseases. We go to the barber shop, and the people who are waiting in line to be given a service. We still have the opportunity of going by the market square, by being at the playgrounds. We see many of our people, especially in the rural communities, gathering at parks, at recreational grounds, and having conversations. As long as we're able to do that, and to converse, whether it's through images or through words. I was listening to some of the typical Creole songs, Brokdong and modern Brokdong. And I also listened to some of the music that my late uncle would play on his guitar, albeit that they were boleros. But the stories are all the same. The goings on, the social commentaries that music and song, the conversations that go on in these places have a similar tinge, and they have a major objective. What are things that are going on? How are they impacting us? And how can we act or react? Our problem is mostly that we've reacted more than being proactive. And there are very few, opportunities, there are very few programs, there are very few uh, activities that are very proactive. And so within the school system, we know that we have some teachers who are very much on the go in understanding that what they are doing is molding minds and truly trying to get them ahead to understand that it's not just about one individual, but it's about all of us. We see it in the music. Our young people, many of our young people are engaging in social commentaries. Um, we see it in programs such as this one that you run, Sister YaYa, that highlight the values, that highlight who we are and what we should be aiming for. So that gives me hope. And it gives me even more hope when I see other young people dropping by the archives or logging onto particular websites. For example, those that we run at the Institute for Social and Cultural Research that bring out information to the general public. Um, it, it gives me hope that more and more we will be able to access information, and more importantly, that those values that have been passed on from one generation to another. I guess you and I are what, 5, 6, 7 generations in when we look at our African heritage. When we look at, for example, I know TV Ramos was writing out from Stan Creek to the newspapers back then, and look at what he was able to do. Look at what others have done. It gives me hope that yes, communication will continue to be there, and that those values are going to transform, if not everybody, at least the majority within the, 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 the few years that we made, within the next few decades, I should say. So yes, there will be people who will continue to, the fire that you have burning, the impetus to shed light where it has been dimmed before is going to catch on. And so yes, there will be people who are going to make a difference. But you and I are the catalysts. All of us have to do our share. And one step at a time.
Thanks, Brother Giovanni. Okay, get final 2 cents, Brother Akko.
The question is, what is the question, Sister YaYa?
I'm going to ask you for your final 2 cents. I'm going to ask Brother Giovanni, because of his work experience and the wealth of information he have access to, what
hope,
gives him hope in 2025?
The hope, yes. Now,
Yeah.
You know, C.L.R. James, again, one of our foremost thinkers on Cuba, he said that West Indian people are the most rebellious in history. You know? And what we see sometimes is our young people, which we think as dysfunction, sometimes really rebellion. Rebellion against the things that somehow they see don't make any sense. But like with everything else, it has to be directed. And we have not been able to engage them in a way that can direct that rebellious spirit. You know? And that, I think, so that gives me hope. Because I speak with them, you know, so you listen to the music they listen to. They have found ways to reject the status quo. But there is no, what I call, replacement idea or ideology, because the system is constantly trying to neutralize and discredit whatever exists in terms of people trying to propagate a different idea. So I am very hopeful when I look at that rebelliousness, and it is throughout the Caribbean. It is throughout the Caribbean, right? Because I know once that is given a perspective and a directive, it will become productive and positive, right? You look, for example, just to aside a bit, what is happening in Africa? You know, this young leader, Ibrahim Traore, emerges. and all over Africa, right? Young people are, today I'm looking at protests in Ghana, demonstrations in Ghana, all over, because finally they got a perspective of what is possible, right? And I think we have to be constant, like Brother Giovanni said, and like we have to be constant and holding up our ideas and propagating our ideas, but also we have to be more deliberate in engaging young people. We have a tendency to what I call just kind of not dismiss them, but marginalize them. And we use language like Generation X and Generation Y. You know, those are things I don't like to use at all. I lived in the US, this Generation X was very popular. And I asked the question, how you call X is the unknown in mathematics. How will your children become unknown to you? By calling them Generation X. And now it's Generation Y and Gen Z and, and all of these things. And all of this is what I mean with the language of colonization and imperialism. We have to stop using that language and find ways to engage our young people because they want the same thing we want, a better life, right? They understand oppression because they live it through lack of employment opportunities, through lack of opportunities, period. And one of the things that we have to understand is that the space that sometimes we grew up in, there was more space for us. Today, the entire space is politicized. The cultural space is politicized. The social space is politicized. You do something and the politicians want to come in, and when they come in to help you, they are handicapping you, right? Because their interest is to serve the system. And so I think part of what we have to do is to create space, free space, liberated space, that young people can be free to express themselves.
Thanks, Brother Akko. Thanks, Brother Pinelo. I just want to add 2 cents that in 1972, I think it was, if you go pull up that article, Christy, United Black Association for Development, our parent organization, had a march downtown Belize City in recognition of African Liberation Day, but they did it on the 29th because why it coincided with one of the revolts, the largest revolt of African sisters and brothers that Belize. So for just make it known, pan the record, that the UBAD, as far as we know, that the first set of African people were start, and they had others, and they had serious organizing. Remember, I was hail up Sister Lilette Barkley in Zinga Wade for being instrumental in X and the other X's, Rufus, ancestor Charles Egan. People were organized and with community support when it comes to African Liberation Day. So us being intentional today, that definitely not the first, but just to carry on one baton that was passed to us. And then I'm going to look for a book where I want to show, that's why important with people telling your own stories, from colony to nation, women activists and the gendering of politics in Belize, 1986 by Annie X. McPherson. Well, in 1912, I think it was, Brother Giovanni had mentioned it, of Creole being used in the colonial newspaper, written, the Creole language, written. But when you don't know your past, then when one new set of people come and tell us something, you just run with it. And that's why it matters who tell a story, how they tell a story, when they tell a story, what story they tell. And so I really encourage you. Today I'm going to share on WhatsApp one story where I just find, I think I sent it to you, Christy, and I know that almost time for we're done. But I wanted a story then where I have one particular interest in now, because as it relates to Belize and African people, I want to know the story of everyday working class people, how they resist. And so for the first time, and the way I interpret it, that my African ancestors and ancestors, because the first time I find it today. I don't know if you don't have one hard copy of this, Belizean Studies, Volume 7, Number 6, November 1979. I'm talking about the laborers' rights. 1894.
Riots.
I just read it as it's written in the historical documents.
Okay.
So they tell the story. So therefore, and there's relevance, and Brother Akko championed it here. That's something where I'm consistently aware of. For me, I'm very sensitive to the word enslave, enslaver, as opposed to slave. To say the human trafficking, kidnapping of our people. Because once we buy into the trade word, then we're buying into the commodity, the selling and buying of our human ancestors and ancestors and the labor they do. So historically, it's identified as the laborers' right of 1894. We, the say, as aware people, now uprising, revolting, they plan, organize, observe of 1894. And if anybody need it, you could just send me 671-8050, that's my number, and I'll send it to you. But very detailed of how African people organize enough for their best interests. And they never immediately revolt. But no, long story, brother Giovanni, we have to bring you back along with brother Rolando for talk about this first documenting that we know of. I would say that like 50 something years after the ending of legal chattel enslavement, where you have the constabulary force, the revolt, the Orange Walk. Anyways, thanks to show that Christy, you've been doing very good following the storyline. I know that 1 minute after 12, but I'm just taking Librata. Brother Giovanni and Brother Ako, if there's anything else you want to add before we end the program, or got like a minute each for added. Anything else you want to add, Brother Giovanni?
Not at the moment. As such, I know that we will be back at some point because yes, Sister YaYa, we have quite a lot of work to do, and I'm willing to share my time and my knowledge and my experience at the archives to share what we know about Belize. The more we do that, bringing out these stories and for each and every person to be able to have access and to interpret it in their own way, I think that is an important part of our labor, of our duty to share with everyone. And have a great Sunday.
Thanks, Brother Giovanni. Brother Ako?
So, Sister YaYa, I want to leave the audience with one message. There is a term that is used, it was first used in education, called cognitive dissonance, which, people have problems with learning and so on. And what has evolved since, and it's deliberate, with mass media and social media. One writer refers to it, and he has 2 books on it, a European academic. He said this is cognitive warfare. And what is happening in the world is that the tiny elite that seeks to dominate the world, they are waging cognitive warfare against the population. Through the media, the print media, the television, social media. And we have to be aware of that. So what we eat, to what we listen to, how to try to reorient our consciousness. So we have to understand that we are in fact in a battle, and which is very much the control for the control of our mind. So it is not just cognitive dissonance anymore. It is an advanced stage of cognitive warfare.
Big thanks for the reminder, Brother Ako. Our security guard today, I do believe, because he usually works past Sunday, and it is Brother Shane Flowers at XTV. We have with Sister Technical Director Krista Flowers. Then I can folk, I know the whole lot of flowers in the back of the fence. Directly Kirsty, I call you Kirsty. Kirsty is Christy's daughter. Yeah, she a heavy zinc fence. She a heavy zinc fence. They live right across the street, like literally right across the street. Front a zinc, side a zinc. Yeah, Paloid family they both. Paloid is an ancestor now. That Kirsty grandpa. Kirsty great grandpa. Downstairs in the 2nd floor, Creme Radio, we have Larry Guerrero, known as Larry G. Thanks for bear patience with me, Larry G. This show on repeat at 5:30 on XTV. Or you could share the link from XTV Belize YouTube, XTV Belize Facebook. And on behalf of United Black Association for Development, we want to say UEF, big thanks to ISCR Niche for continually partnering with us in different ways for, as far as we concerned, to make sure the story of African people get told in our language of Belizean people could relate to, and for know that this the one, majority of Belizean people trace their roots either to African or indigenous people. Majority of the population of Belize trace their ancestry to African and or indigenous roots. So anytime we have conversations, A and B within that framework, because the African Liberation Day, we focus strongly upon African people today, but know that this that is story at the country when we have these conversations. So brothers, enjoy the rest on a Sunday. And remember people, only the people want to save the people.
Save the people.
One love.
This one goes out to all patriots. All people who love them country bad, love them homeland. Will never give it up to another nation. This happy we Guatemala. Follow me now. This happy we Africa. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. This time me name is Pupa. Believe me, come from the Billy City area. 110% believe.